Thanks, everyone. My name is Dwight Fettig. I'm with Porterfield, Fettig, and Sears, and this is my colleague Bryan Blom, also from the firm. We want to thank Buzz and NAAHL for the invitation to be with all of you here today. We've had the privilege of working with NAAHL and many of the members to advance the affordable housing initiatives with policymakers here in Washington. It's been our pleasure to be able to do that. We know a lot of you, a lot of familiar faces, and so it's fun to be here today. As everyone knows, we're less than a week away from the midterm elections. We thought it would be a good opportunity to give everyone a little bit of insight based on our conversations and some of the folks we've been talking to in terms of the election, and then also kind of pivot right after that into the lame duck session. We obviously have what could be a very busy 5 or 6 weeks for Congress when they come back in November and December. So we're gonna start there, and I'm gonna turn it over to, well, and after that, of course, we'll have some Q&A, and then I'll turn it over here to Bryan to get us started on our election preview.
Yeah, thanks again. Thanks, Buzz and NAAHL, for having us. So just wanted to kind of give a quick rundown of the House and maybe the Senate. On the House, so as you all know, Democrats control the House, but it's by the most narrow of margins, only about a 5-seat majority. So the Republicans feel pretty good about their chances of taking over the House. That's, of course, due to, kind of the dissatisfaction with Biden and crime, inflation, but also historical trends. I mean, just if you look back at the 19 last midterm elections, the president's party has lost seats in 17 of those. There's only 2 anomalies, kind of the end of Bill Clinton's term and then George Bush after September 11th when he kind of rode that wave of patriotism. So there are historical trends kind of working in favor of the Republicans and against the Democrats. There's also a few, and the average loss in those seats is about 25 seats, and a lot of those pollsters and prognosticators today think it could be anywhere from kind of 10 to 25. There's fewer and fewer seats in kind of the toss-up category. So as you all know, every 10 years they do redistricting. So a lot of members are running in kind of new territory or different territory, and a lot of the states control those redistricting lines, and Republicans currently control kind of more state legislatures, so they gained a little bit of advantage from redistricting. And so that's kind of a unique year, but it's also a unique year because of a lot of things that have gone on over the last couple of years, and so that kind of tends to favor Democrats. Dwight, you want to maybe talk about some of that?
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. Right, as Bryan said, there are the historical trends that tend to work against the president's party in their first midterm. But you have some of these sort of unique circumstances here that the Democrats have sort of maybe working in their favor to try to counter some of that historical disadvantage. So things like, obviously, the Supreme Court decision earlier this year on Roe versus Wade, the fact that former President Trump has been sort of inserted in many of these races by endorsing candidates, particularly in the Senate, where some of his high-profile endorsements have led to those candidates winning those primaries and now being the general election candidate in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Georgia and even out in Arizona. So you have sort of the Trump factor, and we saw in 2016 and in 2020, and really even in 2018 in the last midterm, how that seemed to really sort of increase turnout, right? Both for Democrats and Republicans in terms of turnout. And then you also have, early voting is kind of a thing now that's really taken hold. We've had sort of our pandemic sort of voting patterns of 2020. And the early vote is, again, very strong and heavy. Unclear exactly at this stage with 6 days to go what that's going to mean for sort of the results. But it does sort of be another indication we could be headed towards historic turnout levels once again. So 2018, we had over 53% of eligible voters vote in a midterm, by far the highest in almost 100 years. Most of our lifetimes, I think we saw midterm election percentages in the mid-30s to low 40% of eligible voters. And to have 53 in 2018 was rather unusual. Fast forward to 2020, the presidential number for total turnout for the whole country of eligible voters was somewhere around 66, 67%. I'm old enough to remember when, mid-50s was considered a really good turnout sort of number. So to have these turnout numbers in the last 2 elections, a midterm and a presidential, kind of reach those levels, and it looks like we're on pace for that kind of sort of historic turnout, which all of a sudden now is no longer historic, it's just the new normal. So we'll have to see how that plays in.
Yeah, and then just turning over to the Senate. So obviously, this is the longest we've ever had a 50-50 Senate. There are a number of seats in play. There's kind of 4 that we've been watching primarily, and you all probably know this. A lot of you probably are in battleground states or districts, and so you probably see a lot of these ads anyways. But Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada are kind of the seats that could control the majority of the Senate. The Democrats are playing kind of more defense on their turfs because they do have incumbents in Georgia and Nevada and Arizona. Republicans are just playing defense in Pennsylvania. You have a retiring senator there with Senator Toomey. And so in those races, and Arizona seems to be trending a little more in favor of Democrats, and Nevada seems to be trending a little more in favor of Republicans. So Pennsylvania and Georgia. And then to add to the drama, we may not actually know who wins the control of the Senate because in Georgia, you have to have 50% +1 to actually win on Election Day. If not, it goes to a runoff election on December 6th. And you all probably remember this from a couple of years ago where there's 2 Senate races that went to that runoff. So those are things that we're going to be watching on Election Day. Just a few more things that Dwight and I think are going to keep an eye on. We're nerds, so we watch this stuff all the time. But Virginia and Florida, the polls close a little earlier. They're like 7 p.m. Some of the other states, New York's a little later, 9 p.m. The other thing that was kind of talked about, I guess, a couple years ago that could come into play again is this kind of blue mirage or red mirage, where, as Dwight was saying, we've got a lot of absentee early voters, and so some states they start tabulating those on the front end. And so, that's like Florida. And so you'll probably see kind of Democrats surge early in Florida, and then Republicans tend to favor Election Day. So then that will happen. And then in kind of the Rust Belt, it's the opposite. So the absentee early votes aren't tabulated till the end. So you kind of have this Republican surge early on in the night, and then Democrat votes come in later. So those are things just to keep an eye on kind of as the night unfolds. I guess regardless, we do know that neither party is going to end up controlling 60 votes in the Senate, which is kind of the key to pass big legislation. You do have this measure called the reconciliation bill each year where you can get 50 plus 1. But regardless, you're going to need bipartisan support in the Senate next year. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about kind of what's expecting in the lame duck session in the last 2 months here, because I think that's obviously the election will dictate some of what is possible, but there's some things that have to get done.
Yeah, that's right, Brian. And so those election results will certainly change sort of who has leverage or what their leverage is and how they want to sort of try to utilize it. The most likely, of course, being that the House would flip, and then House Republicans would have an incentive to try to have some things not finished in the lame duck so that they would have their gavels and be in the majority in the next Congress to address some of those things. But we're talking about, the fiscal 23 spending has to get done, right? We're currently operating under a continuing resolution until December 16th. And so getting a omnibus spending bill, as they're now typically referred to, completed so that all of the appropriations bills are finished by the 16th is going to be a big push. As we all know, historically, that large appropriations bill and the fiscal year spending getting completed can serve as a must-pass vehicle that other pieces of legislation catch a ride on. Of course, there are things that we're all interested in terms of the tax extenders that potentially could catch a ride on that package, including the housing tax credits that we all strongly support here in this room, neighborhood homes and the expansion of the low-income housing tax credit. The development of a tax extenders package is a big part then of that lame duck sort of activity. What's possible in terms of compromise between Democrats and Republicans, particularly in the Senate, is key. One thing to keep in mind in these lame duck scenarios, and then the other must-pass bill I'll highlight real quick, is of course the defense authorization bill. And that has passed every year for 60 plus years now consecutively. And so while it's, technically not must pass, it's politically become must pass. And it frequently now carries other pieces of legislation with it, as with the omnibus. So those are viewed as the two, the omnibus spending bill and defense authorization bill are really viewed as the two must pass bills in the lame duck. And then lots of other things could potentially catch a ride on those two bills. and that's certainly where tax extenders comes into play. There are one or two other issues that are high profile that could certainly see us get some attention. One is it possible that Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats can figure out a way to deal with the debt limit? Or do Democrats try to deal with the debt limit on their own? Recall there was the debt limit deal between McConnell and Schumer from this Congress that has taken care of the debt ceiling with a number up. It's expected to run out in late fall of 23, so sometime in the fall of 23 or early winter of 23, depending on the use of extraordinary measures. There is some chatter and discussion, we know, among some Senate staff and House staff as to whether or not it's feasible for Democrats to use another reconciliation bill, which they would have available to them under the Senate's budget rules, to try and do it on their own and not let it become a leverage point next year, much like it was in 2011 when Boehner took over a Republican House. We had a Democratic Senate and we had a Democratic president in Obama. So the Biden administration, a lot of them saw this movie in 2011 and didn't really like the ending, and they might want to try to avoid it. So that's another big sort of ticket item that's going to at least come into play in some way, shape, or form here in the lame duck.
Yeah, and again, as we'll find out next week what happens with the election, but I do think if Republicans end up winning the House and the Senate, I think certainly House Republicans are going to be pushing more for kind of a smaller package because I think they feel like they'll have a little more leverage in the new year. I think Senate Republicans are in a slightly different place. We've got a lot of retiring Senate Republicans who have been champions on affordable housing issues. Senator Portman, one who's been kind of lead on Neighborhood Homes Investment Act and a huge champion of LIHTC over the years. Senator Shelby, who's right now the senior Republican on the Appropriations Committee, he's retiring, so he's got incentive to try to get something done. Senator Blunt, a lot of these folks who have kind of been viewed as deal makers in the past are retiring, and so I think there is some incentive from Senate Republicans to try to get something done. And I do think the size of the package matters, especially with inflation. Talking to a lot of Republicans on the Hill, I think they want to try to keep that package as small as possible. So I guess there are chances of both being attached to kind of whether it's the spending bill, whether it's the defense bill that Dwight was talking about. There's also some other very important tax credits that Congress cares about: the R&D tax credit, the child tax credit. So there's a few other tax credits that, and frankly, and I'll give two PSAs. One, don't forget to vote. But two, if you are talking to policymakers kind of in the next couple months, I mean, this is really crunch time to try to get things attached. And on the affordable housing kind of credit issues, the good news is we don't have a lot of opposition out there. It's just kind of prioritization. And so that's kind of the challenges that we've dealt with in the past, is that whether sometimes why it doesn't make sense that we're competing against energy credits, but from kind of a dollar standpoint or size standpoint, that's sometimes what we're dealing with.
And another kind of lame duck dynamic that will come into play, and again, it may depend on if the Senate flips or not, right? If Democrats are able to hang on even a 50-50 sort of Senate, which is maybe their best case scenario at the moment, I think the deals then are going to be cut in the Senate, right? Because remember, in the lame duck, even if the House is flipping for next year, House Democrats still have the majority. So if a deal gets cut between Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans on a spending bill, on a tax extenders package, on the debt limit, whatever else might sort of be able to find its way in. There's a retirement package that Finance and Ways and Means is dealing with called Secure 2.0. There's a number of these things that are out there. If those deals are getting cut primarily, as Bryan said, because you have the deal makers in the Senate Republican caucus who typically are willing to get some of these things done, and they're retiring, and so they may have an extra incentive in terms of legacy, the House Republicans aren't needed for a single vote in the lame duck. Democrats in the House can do all these things without them, right? Mm-hmm. So they are not, House Republicans are not going to want some of that to happen. They just can't do anything to stop it, right? So it's really going to be sort of a deal that's any of these things getting accomplished and over the finish line. It's going to be because of deals cut in the Senate because of that dynamic. And there's going to be some Republicans, and maybe even privately in the House, who are going to want some of these things to kind of clear the decks, right? Because when you take over as a new majority, and let's say, for example, it's a long-term CR, and we don't get an omnibus appropriations done for the rest of fiscal year 23, which goes until September 30th, as everyone knows, and all of a sudden, we're kicking the can down the road, and now the CR goes to February or March, and the first thing you have, if you're McCarthy and House Republicans in the majority, is a potential standoff, and some of your members who are happy to sort of go down the old government shutdown route, right, which we know doesn't sort of work very well most of the time politically. But he's going to have some very hardcore sort of members of his caucus who are going to be unwilling to sort of compromise on things like spending very easily. And so he may have an incentive privately and quietly to let Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans get some of these things off the table and clear the decks for them. So when they take over, they don't have to deal with it right up front.
Yeah, so it's going to be a busy November and December after the election. Maybe just briefly touching on kind of next year, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but in 2023, just given some of the scenarios that it could occur. So if the Republicans do take over House and Senate, Dwight, you want to talk about some of the things that they're going to focus on, and then we can maybe get into
sure.
some changes in leadership as well.
Yeah, right. And even without a change in control, we know we're going to have changes in some of the key committees because of retirements, and we'll highlight a few of those folks. But I do think, if Dems hang on to the Senate, obviously one really significant factor for them will be nominations, right? A lot of us deal with members of the administration, and it was great to have the Deputy Secretary here this morning. It's going to be easier for Senate Democrats if they maintain that majority, even if it's a 50-50 majority, and we saw how challenging nominations can be in a 50-50 Senate. But they would at least be able to continue the way they have when it comes to Biden administration appointees over the next 2 years. If the Senate were to flip, however, all of a sudden it's more challenging, right? Because now Republican chairs of those Senate committees not only control the timing, it's going to be easier for them to push back on certain nominees, and the administration is just going to have to do more consultation with Senate Republicans and the Republican leadership up front if they're going to try to get some of these folks confirmed on a bipartisan basis, which becomes necessary. So that's going to be a sort of a pretty significant sort of factor, I think, initially, when you look at sort of what a change of control of the Senate might mean, for Democrats. And then, of course, if they are able to keep control along with nominees, as everyone knows, affordable housing is a critical issue for Senator Brown. He would remain chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. No term limits for Senate Democrats when it comes to their chairs or ranking members in the Senate. So he is able to continue in that role. Others who are on the committee and still very senior but have their gavels elsewhere is what has allowed him to take on that top spot, as everybody knows. Like Jack Reed, for example, who is technically more senior than Senator Brown on the committee, but has the Armed Services gavel and would be expected to keep that.
Yeah, and on kind of the tax writing committees, so again, Senate will kind of stay the same with the Republican and Dem leadership. Congressman Neal will remain the top Democrat. The Republicans will have a shift, so Kevin Brady's retiring. That actually is also an opportunity because while he hasn't been the loudest advocate for kind of housing tax credits, some of the newcomers may come in, and so there's kind of 3 Republicans competing for that spot right now: Jason Smith, Adrian Smith, and Vern Buchanan. And Jason Smith and Vern Buchanan are supporters of the LIHTC bill, and so hopefully will be a little more helpful there. And then just, big picture, so McCarthy and McConnell will likely remain in their place. McConnell, probably for kind of a couple more years, he wants to be the longest serving leader in Senate history. You could see a change, however, in Democratic leadership with Nancy Pelosi taking more of, there's a number of challengers kind of that are interested in that position. So those are things, regardless, I think you're going to have a younger, more diverse class on both sides of the aisle, to be honest. And I love 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds, but I think you're going to see some younger members on both sides of the aisle. So that's one thing that we do know. I know we're coming up on 10 minutes.
Yeah, let me just add real quick, and then we're opening up to Q&A, and we're happy to talk about races, individual races, state dynamics, lame duck sort of situations, whatever anyone wants to talk about next year. But in terms of next year, Senate banking, as I should have highlighted, will have that change, right? As everybody knows, I think Senator Toomey is retired, so Tim Scott is next in line to take over for Senate Republicans on the banking committee, regardless of whether it's chair or ranking member. They do have term limits. They have 6-year term limits as ranking, 6-year term limits as chair. That doesn't come into play here just because Toomey's retiring. And that's what allows Crapo, obviously, to stay as ranking or chair over at finance, as Bryan pointed out. And he's nowhere near his term limits when it comes to the finance committee. So again, even though he would have seniority over Scott at the banking committee, he has actively chosen to take that role at the finance committee, which is what now opens it up for Tim Scott. I will just say, based on what I know between the way the banking committee has sort of been operating in recent years, I do believe that Senator Brown and Senator Scott work fairly well together. I think there's some mutual respect. I think they sort of can disagree without being disagreeable. So I think it's more similar to what we saw probably with the relationship between Senators Crapo and Brown, I think is sort of what people can expect.
Yeah, and Tim Scott and Senator Brown are early co-sponsors of Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is positive as
Correct.
well. So, but happy to take any questions. We can talk presidential 2024. We can talk about November, December. We can talk about whatever you guys want. Individual races, individual issues. Happy to take any questions if anyone has them. You can give Dwight the curveballs. I'll take the softballs. But yes.
She's going to bring you a mic.
So I'm just curious, what are your odds on both of the houses in terms of flipping to Republican control? And I'm also particularly interested in the Fetterman versus Oz race in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And your take on that.
Good questions. I'll give my odds. I mean, I do think the House is flipping. I think it's a reasonably good chance, probably 75, 80% chance. Some people probably have it a lot higher than that, but I do think that the House is certainly likely to flip. I think the more important thing in terms of if the House does flip, as all the analysts say, and look, they've been wrong before, they could be wrong again. These turnout numbers, could surprise us potentially. But assuming it does flip, I think the size of the margin is something we're going to keep a close eye on, because that's really going to help or determine, I think, sort of how governable that caucus is for McCarthy. Remember, Paul Ryan was Speaker for about 3.5 years. And I think Boehner was maybe 4-ish, 4 plus, less than 5. So that's a declining sort of trend line. I don't know how long McCarthy's in that job, right? I don't know how long anybody's in that job, right? And so that's sort of something to keep an eye on. I think margin of if it's a really narrow margin, his life's going to be brutal. That's the worst job in Washington, potentially. Senate, I think I still give Democrats just a slight edge, but it's slight. I mean, it really is pretty much a toss-up. And the reason I give them a slight edge is I think we could see 2 seats flip, one for each party. And I think the Pennsylvania seat does just narrowly go to Democrats. I think it's close. I think primarily, I think it flips because I think the governor's race there is a significant factor. Shapiro's the Democratic nominee, for those who don't know, and a guy named Doug Mastriano's the Republican nominee. Shapiro's running double-digit points ahead in the polling. Even if he doesn't win by quite that much, he's going to win pretty handily. And I do think that is sort of potentially going to help Fetterman, and Oz would have to get, in theory, a lot of Shapiro voters. So I think that's probably why he sort of has a slight edge there, and that would give Democrats a 50-50 Senate, is my estimate or guess.
Yeah, so I think I was more in line with Dwight a couple months ago. The trend line seems to be favoring Republicans. I think I've got it 98% Republicans take the House, and as far as the Senate, I do think the trend lines, again, if you look at recent polling, if you look at, and I know some of the early voting I think has been favorable to Democrats, but if you look at, and polls have been wrong before, they've tended to undercounted Republicans in the past couple of cycles. And so I do think, in Georgia, Herschel Walker, surprisingly, is still, despite some of the scandals, looks like he's in the race, and that could, again, lead to a runoff. And I do think that Oz in the last couple of weeks, and it's interesting, Dwight and I actually have both worked for senators with strokes, so we totally understand the challenges. We both worked for senators that had, strokes kind of before
while they're in the Senate.
While they're in the Senate.
And had time to recover.
And they were incumbents. So it is difficult to kind of watch it play, as a campaign. If I was campaign manager, I probably would not have put him on stage, but that's just me. I think that that debate, some of the trend lines after that have tended to favor Dr. Oz. And then Nevada is interesting. That one, like I said, is moving more in the Republicans' favor. And Arizona, which I think favors Democrats right now, has all of a sudden tightened a little bit too. So I give the Republicans advantage right now in the Senate.
And just add real quick, and then Kirsten has a question. The governor's races in some of these key Senate races are intriguing. It's not just Pennsylvania where there's a governor's race that could be sort of impactful on a Senate race. You have a really close governor's race in Arizona with a Senate race. Obviously in Georgia there's a governor's race, high profile. So I think those governor's races, certainly can be impactful because they're at the top of the ticket. They're helping to spend money on get out the vote.
That's right.
And they're a big part of that.
Well, good morning, guys. Thanks so much for being here.
Of course.
I have about 100 questions, but I'll stick to one. Kirsten Johnson, Obie with NeighborWorks. I'm just curious what you think the election's impact might be on the regulatory environment. There's a lot, if you heard the DepSec, there's a lot of RFIs, which means they're also looking to do other things, in the future. But we have those of us who write comment letters know there's a lot of stuff out there. So what do you think is going to the impact might be there?
That's a great question, Kirsten. I do think, again, that's where Senate control in particular could be critical. I don't know that we'll have any sort of high-profile new nominations to deal with, and if anybody steps down. But in that case, that could affect some of the rulemakings, depending on where they are. But I think it also affects in terms of the oversight that's going to occur of the regulators, right? I think we could expect if House Republicans take control, the sort of oversight they would plan to do of the regulators, whether that's the CFPB or anyone else, is certainly going to be probably more frequent and maybe more adversarial, right? And so if Senate Democrats were to hang on, that might make things a little bit easier for the regulators in terms of that oversight and that activity. I think you're going to see both chambers, members in both chambers, majorities in both chambers, trying to influence those regulators by that sort of hearing process, right? They can't force them to do things a certain way when it comes to the rulemaking, but they certainly will try to influence them, and I think that's a big part of that process. And let's be honest, we now have regulators, because of the Supreme Court decisions that impacted the CFPB and the FHFA, for example, they know their sort of time is limited, right? That clock is ticking. They have 2 years left, basically, that they know they have for sure. They don't know what happens after 24. And so they have to be thinking, same for the SEC, for example. So they have to be thinking sort of in those terms, in terms of these rulemakings, and that's why I think you'll see sort of a lot of activity, but Congress interacting with them very directly. Any other questions? See, we have one in the back there.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. Erin Quinn with Wells Fargo. So on your point about a sense of urgency, do you see a conversation starting up again about housing finance reform?
Not in the short run. Does a new Congress, a new Senate, new House leader, maybe. Senator Scott did a little bit of work when it comes to Freddie and Fannie a few Congresses ago in terms of credit scoring and alternative credit scoring, and so he's played a little bit of role in some of the housing issues. But it doesn't feel to me like it's going to be a top tier sort of priority in the next Congress. Again, I think people have gotten used to the role that Freddie and Fannie play in the marketplace, and so it's not, absent some other developments, it doesn't feel to me now. Obviously, we're in a very different housing market, right?
Yeah, I think, sadly, absent a crisis, I just don't see them wanting to work on it. A lot of the advocates or kind of the bipartisan efforts that have been in the past, with Senator Corker, who's now gone, Senator Warner, who's still there, but you kind of have a lot of the folks that worked on this in the past have either kind of moved on, retired, and so you'd kind of have to have a new crop of senators and members that wanted to pick up the baton and just, Dwight and I have worked in D.C. long enough that, people don't like to fix the roof when the sun's shining. They like to wait till it's, kind of pouring rain and storms coming, and then they'll finally react and fix it. So I just, and given the new leadership in the Senate Bank Committee, which is where that conversation would happen, and the House Financial Services, I think Tim Scott and Senator Brown, who I think would focus on some other issues too first.
Although Bryan and I still have some of the scars from the earlier efforts on GSE reform. Bryan worked for both Senator Johans and Senator Kirk on the Banking Committee during those years of what ultimately became the Johnson-Crapo bill in 2014, and I had worked for Senator Johnson before that. There are some ideas
on some shelf in the Senate. They're collecting dust right now, but they could probably start those over. All right, I think we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Dwight and Bryan for a wonderful presentation and conversation, and for all the work they do on behalf of NAAHL and all of us every day. So thanks again, guys.